In the last class, we discussed that if you want to assess the performance of the economy, we can make use of different indicators. Now, one indicator which is popularly used to assess the performance of the economy is the GDP. Now, first of all, let's just go over the definition of GDP. There are three different ways of viewing GDP. GDP can either be taken as a total income of everyone residing in an economy, or it can be taken as a total expenditure on all the economy's domestically produced goods and services. And lastly, GDP can be taken as a total market value of all the goods and services produced in an economy within a given period of time. Now, there is a little more elaboration which has been done here with respect to the product approach of calculating GDP. Now, here, product approach has been explained using a simple example where in an economy only two commodities are being produced, apples and oranges. So, here we are assuming that in this economy, in the current year, 4 apples are being produced, 3 oranges are being produced, hence GDP turns out to be $5. If GDP rises over time, that is an indication that the economy is doing well. Now, yet another indicator which is popularly used to assess the performance of the economy is the inflation rate. In order to understand how inflation can be computed, you first need to learn the difference between real and nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is defined as price times output. So here, price is taken to be the current price level. So if I want to calculate the nominal GDP for the year 2020, nominal GDP will equal the current price, which is the price level prevailing in 2020 times the level of output produced. So given this definition of nominal GDP, you can see that nominal GDP can rise over time either because of increase in price level or because of increase in output level. Hence, reliance on nominal GDP can be a little deceptive. If nominal GDP is increasing, you cannot tell whether that increase is because of inflation or whether it is because of increase in production. If the increase in nominal GDP is because of increase in production, then you can be satisfied that the economy is performing well over time. But if the increase in nominal GDP is because of inflation, you might be deceived in thinking that the economy is doing well, but the fact of the matter is that that's not the case. The nominal GDP is rising solely because of inflation in the economy. So in order to correct for this, for this deception, we use another measure of GDP which is referred to as real GDP. Real GDP is equal to is price times output. So here price is taken to be, prices here are taken to be constant. We take a base year and the price is always fixed according to that base year. So for example, if I want to calculate the real GDP for the year 2020, I will take constant price level. For example, if my base year was 2015, I will be using the price of 2015 here times the current production, that is the production in 2020. So using this, after looking at this formula for real GDP, you can be assured that if real GDP is rising over time, there can only be one reason why that is so, and that reason is because of increase in output level. This point is also stated over here that growth in real GDP reflects growth in output produced in an economy. So it's a growth in output. So if Y increases, only then real GDP can increase. In contrast, you saw that nominal GDP can increase because of either increase in price or increase in Y. So there is a small example here which will help you further see the distinction between a nominal and real GDP. So in this example, we want to compare the output in 2020 and output in 21 and 2022. So let's assume we take the base year to be of, we take the base year price to be 2020 price level. Hence, all comparison is going to be made relative to the base year. So now, again, we are assuming that in this simplistic economy, only two commodities are being produced, which are apples and oranges. So if you want to calculate the real GDP in 2020, how would we do that? We will take the price of apples in 2020 and we're going to multiply it with the quantity of apples produced in 2020. And we're going to do the same with respect to oranges. So it's going to be the price of oranges in 2020 times the quantity of oranges produced in 2020. Now note that for the base year, the real GDP must equal the nominal GDP. Had I calculated the nominal GDP for 2020, I would have used the same calculations. So for the base year, real GDP is always equal to the nominal GDP. Now, things become more interesting when we move to other years. Now, let's calculate the real GDP for the year 2021. So, if we have to calculate the nominal GDP of 2021, remember, we would use the current price level, that is 2021 price of apples times the current production of apples. But here, since we are computing the real GDP for the year 2021, we have to make this modification that we're going to keep our prices constant. So the prices are going to be held constant to the price level which prevailed in 2020 because that was the selected base year. So the formula for real GDP, it modifies as follows. It will be equal to the 2020 price of apples times the current production of apples. Similarly, we're going to add this up with 2020 price of oranges times the current production of oranges. Similarly, if you want to calculate the real GDP in 2022, we will again take the price of apples constant for the year 2020 and multiply it with the current production of apples, which is 2022 quantity of apples, and we're going to do the same thing for oranges. And this way, when we add these two components up, that will give us the real GDP for the year 2022. So the interesting point to note here is that the 2020 prices are used to compute real GDP for all 3 years. So because prices are being held constant from year to year, real GDP varies only when quantities vary. Okay? So real GDP is a better measure of assessing the performance of the economy as compared to nominal GDP. Nominal GDP can be deceptive because nominal GDP may rise because of either increase in price level or increase in quantity, whereas real GDP can rise only because of increase in quantity. So if quantity is increasing over time, that is a sure-shot indicator that economy is growing over time. Now let's just employ these concepts of nominal and real GDP to understand the next popular indicator which is used to assess the performance of the economy, which is inflation. There are multiple ways of calculating inflation. Now one technique for doing so is the GDP deflator. Now this is the formula of GDP deflator. It is equal to is nominal GDP divided by the real GDP. So for example, if I want to calculate the GDP deflator for the year 2020, this will be the nominal GDP for the year 2020 divided by the real GDP for the year 2020. Now I have elaborated this formula a little more. Nominal GDP, we just saw that it's equal to is current price times quantity. Real GDP is constant price times quantity. So you can see for yourself that Y and Y cancels out. So GDP deflator, it basically measures the price in the current year relative to the prices in the base year. So the GDP, if you read what's written below the formula, GDP deflator, it's also called the implicit price deflator for GDP, and it measures the prices of output relative to its price in the base year. Okay, so it reflects what's happening to the overall level of prices in the economy as compared to the base year, right? So this formula, it clearly shows you the GDP deflator can be very well used to measure inflation in the economy, because it tells us what is happening to the prices in the current year relative to the prices in the base year. So here we have a small example that will also, help you understand how GDP deflator can be calculated. So in this example, we are assuming that the base year is 2013, and in this economy only two commodities are being produced, which are apples and books. So in year 2013, you can see that 100 pens are being produced and 50 books are being produced. In the next year, 120 pens are being produced and 70 books are being produced. And similarly, in 2015, the production of pens remains the same, and the production of books also remains the same, which is 70. Now, if you want to employ the formula for GDP deflator, you know that we need to have a measure of both nominal GDP and real GDP for all the years. So in this column here, I've calculated the nominal GDP for all the years. So the formula for nominal GDP is that it's the current price level times the current production level of pens. Similarly, in this second component here, I'm multiplying the current price of books with the current production of books, which gives me $800. Real GDP is going to be the price of pens in the base year, which incidentally is also 2013, times the quantity of pens produced in 2013 plus the price of books in 2013, which is also 10, times the quantity of production in 2013 of books, which is 15. So this gives me 800 again. So this should not come as a surprise to you that for the base year, the nominal GDP must always equal to is the real GDP. The formula for GDP deflator is that it's the nominal GDP for the year 2013 divided by the real GDP for the year 2013. So this gives me 100%. So I'm just multiplying this entire formula by 100 so that I can convert GDP deflator in percentage terms. So if I do that, I will get 100%. So similarly, I can calculate the GDP deflator for the next year. So here the trick is, so nominal GDP is simple. You have to take the current price level. So it's the price level of the price of pens in the year 2014 times the quantity of pens in the year 2014 plus the price of books in the year 2014 multiplied by the quantity of books that are produced in 2014. The real GDP is a little tricky. You just need to remember this point, that when you're computing the real GDP, you have to take the prices constant. So here I have highlighted this point that the prices that I'm taking, these are 2013 price levels. Okay, so I am taking 3 over here and 10 over here. Okay, so 3 is the constant price of pens, where 10 is the constant price of books. So you can work this out. Real GDP turns out to be $1,060. So GDP deflator will be the nominal GDP for this year divided by the real GDP for this year, which gives me 113.21%. Likewise, you can compute the GDP deflator for the next year, which is 2015. And again, for that, you first need to compute the nominal GDP for 2015. And this is how you compute the real GDP for 2015. The only difference between the calculation of nominal and the real GDP is that I am keeping the price level constant. When I calculated the nominal GDP, I'm using the current price level, whereas when I'm computing the real GDP, I am taking constant price level, and that constant is going to be the base year price levels. Okay, so this turns out to be 137.74%. Now, once we have the GDP deflator, it's quite easy to compute the inflation levels. Inflation is simply the GDP deflator in 2014 minus the GDP deflator in the base year, which is 2013. So this gives me 13.21%. So this means that from 2013 to 14, the prices have risen at a rate of 13.21%. Similarly, if you want to calculate inflation all the way from 2013 to 2015, you simply need to take the percentage change happening between these 2 years, and this turns out to be 37.74%. So remember here, this inflation level, it relates to the increase in price level all the way from 2013, which was my base year, to 2015. If you're interested in inflation rate between 14 and 15, in that case you would have to take the percentage change between these two quantities. Okay. So this was all about how a GDP deflator can be used to calculate inflation in the economy. Yet another technique for computing inflation is the CPI index. This stands for the Consumer Price Index. Here the trick is that you first need to select basket of goods and services which are typically consumed by a consumer, and we take this basket to be constant from 1 year to the next. We are basically comparing the price of the basket in the current year relative to the price of the same basket in the base year. So first of all, let's just read what's written in the handouts. So CPI index, it turns the prices of many goods and services into a single index, measuring the overall level of prices. So you need to be very clear on this point that inflation is not increase in price level of one product. If there is overall increase in price level, that is what we refer to as inflation. So CPI, it turns prices of many goods and services into a single index. So when we convert the prices of many goods and services into a single index, and when you trace the trend of this index, when you trace what is happening to this index over time, that will basically allow you to see whether overall prices are increasing over time or not. So to compute CPI, we first need to choose a basket of goods and services that is consumed by a typical consumer. So CPI is the price of this basket relative to the price of the same basket in the base year. So again, let me just emphasize this point. In CPI, the trick is to select the basket first, and we're going to keep this basket constant from 1 year to the next, and we'll try to assess how does the cost of this basket change over time. So in reality, this is how a typical basket of goods and services gets selected. So the statistical bureau will assess that a typical consumer spends 43% on housing. This typical consumer spends 17% on transportation, 15% on food and beverages, 6% on educational and communication facilities, and so on. But we are going to, assume a much simpler basket. So in order to, let's just go over a simple example, which will help you to see how inflation can be computed using the CPI index. So here again we're assuming a simple example where only apples and oranges are being produced, and we are making this assumption that a typical consumer, he consumes 5 apples and 2 oranges every month. Okay, so our basket, it contains only 2 goods, which are 5 apples and 2 oranges. I've just shown you that in reality the basket is going to contain all the commodities which a typical consumer consumes, and from the US data you can see that a typical consumer spends around 43% of his income on housing, 17% on transportation, 4% on appraisal, and so on. I am simplifying this example and I'm assuming that our typical consumer, he consumes only two commodities, which are apples and oranges, and this is the amount this is the amount of apples and oranges that he consumes per month. So he consumes 5 apples, 2 oranges. So now CPI, how would I compute CPI for the year 2021? I will calculate the cost of basket in this year and relative to the cost of the same basket in the base year. So let's assume that my base year is again 2020. So CPI in this current year 2021 will equal 5 times the current price of apples plus 2 times the current price of oranges. So in other words, this is the 2021 price of orange divided by 5 times the 2020 price of apples plus 2 times 2020 price of oranges. So in this case, in this CPI calculation, 2020 is the base year. The index tell us how much it costs to buy 5 apples and 2 oranges in the current year relative to how much it costs to buy the same basket of fruits in the base year, which is 2020. Okay. So if you compare the calculation of inflation using GDP deflator and CPI, CPI is much simpler to compute. In CPI, you need to keep the basket constant from one year to the next. To further see the distinction between CPI index and GDP deflator more clearly, I am using the same example here that I used for calculating GDP deflator. I am assuming that our economy, it produces only 2 commodities, which are pens and books. And I'm again assuming that the base year is 2013. And furthermore, I have to make this as I have to fix my basket. So I explained to you that in CPI, the first step is to select a basket of goods and services, which is typically consumed by a consumer. So that fixed basket is 10 pens and 50 books. So let's suppose that we do a survey, and based on that survey, we come up with this basket where we say that a typical consumer is consuming 100 pens and 50 books per annum. So we have the same table that we saw when we calculated GDP deflator, but now we want to calculate inflation using the other technique, which is the CPI. So for your convenience, I've already calculated CPI for all the 3 years. So CPI is the price of this basket, which is 150 in the current year. So it's going to be the 2013 so it's going to be the price of this basket in 2013 divided by the price of the same basket in the base year, which incidentally is also 2013 here. Okay, so when you do that, you can see for yourself that this will turn out to be 1. If you can multiply it by 100, this will give you 100%. So remember, for the base year, CPI index will always be 100. Now, when you calculate CPI for the next year, 2014, how would you do that? Again, you have to keep the quantity constant. So when you're computing the CPI, remember the quantity information is of no use for you, because I'm not making use of this information in any of these calculations, because I'm keeping this basket constant. The price information is relevant for me, but not the quantity of production. So this information is not relevant for me now. So when I calculate the CPI index for the year 2014, you can see for yourself that this will be equal to is the price of this basket, 150 in the current year, which is, so here I'm going to take 2014 prices for pens and books, divided by the price of the same basket in the base year. So I'm just taking the same basket, but here, instead of using the 2014 prices, I'm using the base year prices, which was 3 for pens and 10 for books. Okay. It was 3 for pens and 10 for books, right? Similarly, for 2014, for the next year, which is 2015, I'm again keeping the quantity fixed. The price is only changing. So in the numerator term, if you see, I'm using the 2015 prices, but in the denominator term, I'm again using the base year prices. So this gives me 1.375. So you can convert this in percentage terms as well by multiplying these values by 100. Now in the last column, I've computed the inflation rate. Inflation is computed by taking the percentage change in CPI index over time. So if I'm interested in calculating inflation between these 2 consecutive years, how would I do that? I'm simply going to calculate the percentage change here, and this will give me 12.5%. Now, if I am interested in calculating inflation between 2013 and 15, again, you can calculate the percentage change between these 2 years, which you can see it turns out to be 37.5%. Okay, now similarly, we can also calculate the PPI index, which stands for Producer Price Index. Now, this is yet another way of calculating inflation in the economy. So the only difference between a PPI index and CPI index is in the construction of the basket. So when we are computing the CPI index, remember, we construct a basket which is typically consumed by the consumers. If you're using the PPI index, which stands for Producer Price Index, you would have to construct a basket of goods and services which is typically consumed by the producers. So the PPI index would most of the time comprise of raw materials, capital, machinery, equipment, because these are the things which are typically consumed by the producers. So you can assess for yourself that if plant or machineries, when they become expensive, that will show up in the PPI index, but it would not show up in the CPI index. Similarly, if the prices of housing, clothing, transportation goes up, it will most likely show up in the CPI index, but not in the PPI index. So the way to construct inflation, the rate of inflation is the same when you're using either the CPI or the PPI technique, but the only difference is in the construction of the basket. So I'll just repeat this point again, that in the case of PPI index, the basket comprises of commodities which are typically consumed by a producer, whereas CPI index is constructed by assuming a basket which is typically consumed by the consumers. Now, since we have discussed about both CPI and the GDP deflator, we are now in the position to compare and contrast these 2 measures of inflation. You've seen using the previous example that when I calculated inflation using the GDP deflator, my answers were different as compared to when I compute inflation using the CPI index. Remember, in the case of CPI index, the inflation between these 2 successive years, which is 13 and 14, is 12.5%. Whereas when I use the other technique, which is when I use the GDP deflator, my answer turned out to be 13.21%. Now, the question arises, why do we see this difference in our measurement of inflation? Or why do different techniques yield different measures of inflation? Now, just by seeing the way the two indexes are constructed, you can easily figure out why we are seeing this difference in our final measure of inflation. So here on your handouts, you can see 3 main differences, or 3 reasons why we are witnessing different measures of inflation using these 2 different techniques. So the first difference arises because of the following reason. GDP deflator measures prices of all goods produced. Remember, GDP deflator is equal to is the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP. So nominal GDP for the year is going to include all the goods and services which are being produced in that year. Whereas CPI index measures only the prices of goods and services which are produced by the consumers. So let's suppose that in an economy, military equipments are being produced. So of course, when the price of these military equipment goes up, it will show up in the GDP deflator, but not in the CPI index, because a typical consumer does not consume military equipments, right? Thus, an increase in price of goods bought only by the firms or the government will show up in GDP deflator but not in the CPI index. So I hope this point is clear. Let me just repeat it one more time, that GDP deflator, it measures prices of all goods and services. Just to refresh your memory, let's just go back to the formula for GDP deflator. So let's suppose in this imaginary economy, apples are being produced, oranges are being produced, and their military equipment is also being produced. So in order to calculate nominal GDP, you have to calculate the market price of all the three commodities, right? And divide it by its real GDP. But when you calculate CPI index, remember, a consumer typically does not consume military equipment. So since the basket is not going to contain military equipment, so if there is an increase in the price of military equipment, it will not show up in the CPI index, but it will show up in the GDP deflator. So that's the first difference between the two techniques of computing inflation. Now, the second difference is that GDP deflator includes only those goods and services which are produced domestically. Imported goods are not part of GDP and therefore they don't show up in the GDP deflator, but they can show up in CPI index. So this point can also be easily explained. Again, if you look at the formula for the GDP deflator, it's nominal GDP divided by real GDP, and I already explained to you that GDP only contains the market value of goods and services which are produced domestically. So if the prices of imported commodities increases, it will never show up in the GDP deflator. So let's suppose our CPI index, it contains a typical consumer consumes cars, right? It consumes automobiles. So let's suppose that in Pakistan, the typical consumers are consuming imported cars alone. So if the price of these imported cars increases, it will show up in the CPI index, but not in the GDP deflator, because imports are never part of GDP. And the last difference between the two is that CPI assign fixed weight to prices of different goods, whereas GDP deflator assigns changing weights. Or in other words, you can say that CPI, it assumes fixed basket of goods and services. GDP deflator assumes changing basket of goods and services. So this point should be clear to you that in the case of CPI, the basket remains the same from one year to the next. Whereas in GDP deflator, the basket is going to vary. Why would the basket vary? Because production can vary from one year to the next. So if in our imaginary economy, in the next year, the country is able to produce more apples and oranges, so the quantity of apples and oranges is going to increase. You're going to increase the quantity of apples and oranges when computing the GDP deflator in the next year. But that does not happen with the CPI index. If I again show you this example, I explained to you that the basket is going to remain the same. You can see CPI, the calculation for CPI index in these 3 years, and you can see that the basket is the same. Whereas if you're computing GDP deflator, the basket can vary. That is, these quantities can vary. Quantity can vary because the production facility may change over time for an economy. So let's suppose in the next year, the economy was able to expand its production plants, it was able to employ more machinery, hence resulting in greater production of apples and oranges. So Q or this Y is going to increase if you're using GDP deflator. So these are the three fundamental differences between CPI and the GDP deflator. Now let's just go over some exercise questions which will further enable you to understand the difference between CPI and GDP deflator. They are simple true and false questions. So let's just go over these questions one by one and see if you can figure the answer of these questions out for yourself. So the first question is that an increase in price of imported cameras is captured by CPI but not the GDP deflator, right? So this statement is actually true. The reason is that imported goods, they can show up in the CPI index but not in the GDP deflator. So this point, it directly follows from the second point here that we discussed, that GDP excludes imported goods. So whatever is happening to the prices of the imported goods, it does not show up in the GDP deflator, but it can show up in the CPI index, assuming that cameras is part of the basket that a typical consumer consumes. Now moving to the second statement, an increase in price of helicopters purchased by UK armed forces is captured by CPI index. Now this statement is false. The reason is that a typical consumer in UK does not consume helicopters. So since helicopters will never be part of the basket of CPI, anything which happens to the price of whatever happens to the price of helicopters, it will not show up in the CPI index. Hence the statement is false. Now moving to the third statement, an increase in price of diamonds will have a greater impact on CPI than an equal percentage increase in price of food because diamonds are much more expensive. I'm agreeing to the fact that diamonds are definitely more expensive than food, but think about the fact that diamonds, a typical consumer does not consume diamonds, but food is a significant portion of a typical consumer's consumption bundle. So this statement is actually false. If the price of diamond increases, it will not have much impact on CPI index because diamonds are not consumed by a typical consumer. So if the price of food increases, that will have a greater impact on CPI index. So given that explanation, I would say that this statement is false. If CPI rises by 5% per year, then every individual in the country will need exactly 5% increase in their income for their standard of living to remain the same. And so this statement is actually true. The reason is that if your wages are increasing is increasing by 5% and the inflation is also increasing by 5%, that means your standard of living has not changed. You can still buy the same goods and services in the next year as you could have bought in the previous year. So nothing has changed. You can enjoy the same luxuries in life in the previous years as you can in this year. Now coming to the last statement, if your wages rise by 500 per week to €625 euros per week, while CPI rises from 112 to 121, you should feel an increase in your standard of living. Now, in order to answer this question, you would first have to calculate the percentage increase in wages. You can do that and you can see for yourself that the wages are increasing by around 25% here, whereas CPI or the inflation is increasing by 8%. So since the increase in the wage rate is more than the increase in inflation, we can say that our standard of living, the standard of living of this consumer must have increased. Okay, so these are like few questions which will help you, which I presume have helped you to further see the distinction between CPI and the GDP deflator.